Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and it's been a while. I'm kind of refocusing myself in different areas, but a Charles Coulombe book was released, so I just had to read it, and I had to talk with Charles about it, and I had to get you guys the information. So, Charles, welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you very, very much, Connor. Great to be back. It's been too long. And yeah, the answer is fine. I'm suffering postpartum depression from my latest book. Uh, it's
Does that happen a lot?
no, not really. It doesn't happen at all.
Okay.
Uh, no, it's fine. I'm starting to get the very first reactions. Apart from um, the first few people ready to get their blurbs and so forth. Uh, and so far I'm pretty gratified. It was a book that I didn't set out to write because it's a collection of my writings about monarchy over the years. And the people at Peter Krasniewski's Osusti Press did a great job. It was his idea, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
Peter asked what I thought about putting together a collection of some of my writings on monarchy. And I said, well, something like the Complete Monarchist, Compleat. And he said, that'd be a great name. I said, all right, fine. You bet. I'm all
I
for it.
I
Hmm?
didn't know he was a big monarchist.
Now you know.
Okay.
The- Well, I mean, look, the truth is, anyone who knows history and knows scripture, yes, I know inevitably someone will come up and say, "Oh, but God was angry. God was angry at the children of Israel for wanting a king." It's all there in the book of Samuel. The problem is they haven't read the book of Deuteronomy, wherein he describes the kind of king he wants them to have. The
Yeah.
problem is that they wanted a king as the nations around them had, not a king after God's own heart. That's the part that Thomas Paine, when he cooked up that idea, the great theologian Thomas Paine,
Yes.
who laughingly told John Adams when he put that idea out in Common Sense that it was kind of funny because he himself didn't believe in the Old Testament. So he thought it was funny basically that the rubes went for it. And John Adams was shocked. He writes about this in his memoir. It was like, what? But
Was he appalled? Was John Adams appalled?
he was very appalled. I mean, look, when you're trying to write propaganda, it's one thing to try to use arguments that you yourself believe in. I mean, they may be objectively specious, but if you believe in them, if you're using them, you should have some belief in them. But it shows you're horribly, horribly, horribly uh, insincere, shall we say, to base an argument, a serious argument, on premises you yourself don't believe.
Americans are
Knowing,
really good at that.
well, and knowing that your audience are moronic enough to accept them. I mean, what does that say about you?
It's just a
I
bit
mean, it says,
embarrassing, especially 200 something years ago.
well, yeah, and in fact, people still consider Thomas Paine to have been a great patriot and all that. Well, so was Al Capone. What's your point? I
Well,
mean,
one of my favorite conversations on this podcast was actually with Dr. John Bergsma, and we talked about Samuel, and we talked about that passage in the Bible, and he goes through why that interpretation is just false, and I find that most gratifying to hear biblical scholars agree.
they of course they agree because, as I say, if you do read the Bible, now mind you, I'm not saying you should have an opinion on a book and read about it. God forbid. I mean, that would just be horrible.
You
Can
mean
you
people
imagine?
shouldn't have or shouldn't should have an opinion about your book but not read it?
They should just think it's wonderful.
Oh, okay. I see how it is.
Don't read it. Just think it's great and buy copies for all your friends. No,
Yeah,
uh, no. I mean, it's like a wonderful line in Whit Stillman's film Metropolitan, where all through the first part of the film, the protagonist and the heroine have been arguing over Jane Austen, and finally, she challenges his attack on one of the novels, and he says, "But of course, I haven't read it." And she says, "What? Well, what Jane Austen novels have you read?" He says, "Oh, none of them. I never read novels. I only read good literary criticism. That way, that way you could find out what the best minds are thinking about it, as well as get the gist of the author." He says, "With novels, I can never forget that none of it really happened."
wow. Okay.
And he says, "You don't have to have an opinion about a book to have you don't have to read a book to have an opinion about it. I've never read the Bible either."
There are a lot of
So,
people who have an opinion about the Bible that have never read the Bible.
well, indeed, as I say, it's every modern person's right to have an opinion about everything. In fact, his duty, he's required to have an opinion about everything, despite how little he may know about it. The
That's
less he
what
knows, the
Twitter's
more.
for.
I'm sorry?
That's what Twitter's for.
Exactly. This is my point. The less you know about something, the more you have an obligation not only to have an opinion, but violently and to attack anyone who differs from you. And the less you know about it, the more violent your attack should be.
And you must gather 1 million followers
Well, yeah, that's
to
the
do
only way to
so.
prove that you exist as a person. And so that requires you to use the most violent language you can.
Well, yeah. It's an
And,
obligation for the modern man.
well,
So,
and
so this was, this was in some ways an unintentional book for you.
well, it was, and the writings themselves really go back and forth over my entire career. Um, you know, the earliest ones I wrote in my 20s, I guess, and then the latest just in the past year.
I mean, I could kind of figure out that, or I mean, obviously, I figured out that they were articles, so they weren't necessarily written at the same time. But I wouldn't necessarily have pinpointed them that far apart from each other.
Well, my views haven't changed.
Yeah.
You know, it. I mentioned in the book there's a section that I wrote actually within the past couple of years. I forget exactly when, but it's fairly recently, called "Confessions of an American Monarchist," and I pretty much explained there how it happened, how I deviated from the path of Republican virtue and joined the legions of the darkness. Um, well, I mean that's when you say you're a monarchist, people look at you like you just announced your conversion to leprosy. As though you chose to be a leper. But a few years ago, a lady I know called me America's best loved monarchist. And I said that's like being America's best loved leper. Thank you. But but no, the in a nutshell, I think it was Chamoras who said that there are two kinds of royalists, which is a synonym here. Um, those of reason and those of tradition. In other words, there are those who come from families that were royalist, and there were those that, speaking of the French situation specifically, but still, and then there are those who reason themselves into it. And then there are those, of course, who are a bit of both. Well, you could say that my family certainly weren't monarchists or royalists at all. They were, patriotic constitutionalists, but they did not have the anti-monarchical prejudice that the vast majority of us are supposed to have. And that, coupled with the fact that I was I paid attention. I noticed that when the when there was a dispute between a constitutional monarch and a king, historically, the king was usually right, and yet he would usually lose. and that loss would be a disaster for everybody involved, and yet, in retrospect, be designated by the academic media and government machines as a triumph for democracy.
Yeah.
And
One
that
of these examples was with I can't pronounce the Belgian pronunciation, but it's King Baldwin of
Baudouin,
Belgium.
yeah, Baldwin, yeah,
It is Baldwin in English, right?
yeah.
Okay. I'm just gonna say Baldwin. You can pronounce it correctly. But he was recently was didn't Pope Francis recently say something about him?
Well, yeah, he ordered the opening of his cause for beatification, because Baudouin was very devout, um, to say the least, more devout than most of the bishops in Belgium in his days. Uh, and well, in fact, the bishops of Belgium were not happy with his cause for canonization being opened because he opposed abortion when they didn't.
And so how did he do that? How did he oppose abortion?
Well, I mean, just like in every other country in Europe, he delayed it coming to Belgium by almost 30 years because Belgium was like every other country in Europe. In the late 60s, early 70s, um, the left in Belgium wanted to make abortion legal. Now, part of the problem in those days was that the Christian Democrats in every country in Europe, not just Belgium, they would never do anything politically without the blessing of the local hierarchy. Now, 1968, Humane Vitae comes out, and a lot of national hierarchies, to include Belgium, basically discarded it. They refused to accept it, because their ladynesses or whatever they call themselves, you know, their non-binary ships or whatever they were. They, well, I don't know. They must have had names for themselves.
I think that's
Uh,
today. I think that's the would be them today.
not not much
Oh.
has changed. Well, not really, not a lot of places. I mean, it's better in some ways in some places. But you got to bear in mind that these people, the current crop, have inherited a situation. These people were the ones who initiated it. There's a difference. If you inherit garbage from me, but I'm the one who made the garbage, well, all right, if you keep going along with the garbage, that's a bad thing. But at least you didn't initiate it. I began it.
You would never give me garbage, though.
Well, I would if I were Cardinal Sweenens of Belgium,
Okay.
or for that matter, Cardinal Daniels. The great hider of pedophiles. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I don't judge people's actions.
You're a
I'm not,
Californian.
exactly. We're not capable of judging anything. If we were, we wouldn't have reelected Governor Newsom, now would we? But anyway, see, that's a triumph of non-judgmentalism.
It reminds me of in, a short story by Evelyn Waugh called "Too Much Tolerance."
Yeah, yeah,
It's
and that.
yeah. That which speaking of, before I forget, your book basically encompasses almost all my major interests, except for Evelyn Waugh. He's the only one that I think is left out.
Well, I mean, Evelyn Waugh, of course, was a monarchist.
Yeah,
He, but much as I enjoy his writing, and I do, he was not a very pleasant person,
true, true, true.
and so I don't like citing him really in defense of anything. I mean, no
Okay.
matter how much I may agree with the particular point, he was a nasty guy. I mean, there's the famous story of his walking down the street with a friend, and this lady comes up to him and said, "You're Evelyn Waugh." He goes, "Yes," and she says, "Oh, I loved whatever the book was," and he let her have it. Said, "Well, it must have been garbage if a woman as stupid as she liked it." And just goes on and on at the poor one.
Oh
She
my.
slinks away, and his friend says, "That was horrible." And you call yourself a Catholic? And he says, "Yeah, well, think how much worse I'd be if I weren't Catholic."
Yeah, yeah, that's an unfortunate story, and I'm guessing there are many of those.
Yeah, sadly. So
Sad,
don't expect me to use Yves Lenoir to defend anything, no
because
matter
he'd
how
be
much
upset
I
with
may
you.
agree with him. What's that?
He'd be upset with you.
No, not when we spoke last. No, no. I never had the pleasure of being attacked by him, so I couldn't tell you.
You were
I,
too you were too young
that's right.
to be attacked by him.
I'm sure if he'd seen me, he would have said, "Who's the stupid looking kid?" And someone would have said, "We can't say that. All right, it's just ugly." Something along those lines.
Yet he wrote spectacular fiction.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that
Yeah.
you can't take away his talent. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I distracted us. Can you continue with the story of King Baldwin?
Well, I mean, there's not a lot to say except that because the bishops wouldn't back up the Christian Democrats, they caved.
So they put
And
forward a bill of to push put through
ev-
abortion?
eventually,
Okay.
but it was 25 years that he kept refusing to sign such a bill.
That's a long time.
It is, and they kept pressuring him and pressuring him and pressuring him, and he didn't have the support of the bishops, who played the role of that great apostle Judas Iscariot. And so he eventually they came up with this face-saving deal whereby he abdicated for a day.
Was he forced to abdicate for a day, like, in the sense where or, like, did he voluntarily abdicate for a day?
Well, it was the choice was volunteer for a day or for good. You choose.
Yeah.
And you got to bear in mind, there's an old joke in Belgium that there's only one Belgian, the king.
Is that
Everyone else is
yeah.
because everyone else is a Walloon or a Flamand, and without the monarchy, Belgium would have broken up a long time ago. But the funny thing is, back then, conservative Orthodox priests, especially young ones, when they was offering the mass, they wouldn't say the name of the local bishop. They'd say his name instead.
Wait, the kings?
Yeah, Notre.
Is that legal?
Well, it has been in different places at different times
Oh, okay.
to say the name of the king in the
Uh,
canon. Now, to
hmm,
say it instead of the bishop maybe is a little dodgy. But
yeah.
if the bishop's in favor of abortion and birth control, and didn't see a perversion he didn't like, what's a boy to do?
I guess that's a is that a prudential judgment?
I've never been in that position, so I couldn't tell you. But that's all I could call it. I mean,
But yeah, okay, so and then so he abdicated for a day. But what do you make of Pope Francis like setting up his or allowing the opening of his canonization or possible canonization process?
he did more than allow it. He ordered it.
Sure. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think the bishops of Belgium annoyed him, and he did the thing that would drive their lordships the most up a tree. Because a number of them have been complaining about it ever since. Although he doesn't fire them, which of course he would do if they came out in favor of an orthodox doctrine or something too loudly.
But he supports supports the cause of this king who supported traditional doctrine.
Oh, I know, but
Yeah.
I think it's a question. You got to bear in mind that the Holy Father is a very personalized sort of fellow. A
Yeah.
lot of what he does is by what pleases or displeases him.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's not as doctrinaire as you might think. It's more if you look at who he attacks and who he insults. A lot of it has to do with the battles of his youth. So he's settling old scores. A lot of the time, seemingly on people who are dead. It's as though I became president, and I had always had a problem with the geography teachers of my youth, and I went on a vendetta against the teachers of geography because when I was a kid, most countries of the third world were colonies, and so I just start, raging against these geography teachers who don't support independence of the colonies.
As you should.
Well, indeed. Now, of course, the little problem there is that the vast majority of colonies are independent now.
Sure.
And so when you hear me raging about these terrible colonialist geography teachers,
They're not really the same. They're not the same people.
well, they're not
Or
the same people. It's not even the same cause. And
yeah,
you'd
exactly.
you'd look and you'd say, what? What is he talking about? Colonialist uh, geography teachers. Nobody's pushing colonialism today. What is it on about?
Yeah.
And then I get very annoyed that you were attacking me.
For saying that you've lost it.
Yeah, and I'd call you a pro-colonialist. You know, you're probably in favor of the Coulombe staying in Algeria, aren't you?
Sure.
Yeah. Of course, they all had to leave in 1962, but this is real. It's very real to me.
Yes. Makes sense. Totally makes sense. It's all very rational.
One of the
Now,
great things about human beings is that we rarely are rational.
yes, of course.
I mean, we can be. It's not like it's beyond our grasp. It's
Sometimes
just
it
that we
feels
often.
like that though.
Well, that's because it's very easy to be irrational. It's very easy to let our emotions rule us, um, to think what we should think instead of really thinking.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that out of like some pompous. I feel that about myself sometimes.
Of course,
Yeah.
we all do it. I mean, one of the problems with being a human being on public view is that all of your foibles are shown up. And of course, you and your handlers try to make yourself look as good as possible. But
You have
you know,
handlers?
well, I'll put it this way: one of my favorite fairy stories, nursery tales, is the Emperor's New Clothes. And what I've always found funny about it is that when it comes to everyone else with a little kid pointing out, "Oh, he's naked, he didn't wear anything," but when it comes to ourselves, we're all the emperor. You know, you see how lovely my wonderful new clothes are. Sure, you bet, they're great.
That's why confession is so helpful.
That's why confession is so important, because it's one of the few places where we really get to look at ourselves in the moral mirror.
Yeah.
If we do it in the right spirit. That's why traditionally, I don't know about now, but traditionally, the Pope, A, went to confession every day, but B, would sign a renunciation of liturgical errors he might have made during the day
Oh wow.
so that nobody could seize on them as, oh, look, the Pope does it.
That's tough to be in a situation where you make even if you were like making accidental mistakes
Well, yeah,
to have to
because,
be denunciating yourself.
you mispronounce a word or you make a wrong motion. And there was, oh my heavens, the Pope did it. I can do it too. Whee! Well, you don't want that. So they would sign this daily renunciation of liturgical error.
Is everyone in your head a 5-year-old? Whee!
I think, well, my late father used to say that adults are just little kids riding around in old bodies.
Yeah.
So yeah,
But
everyone in my head is a 5-year-old. Just say hello. Whee!
whee! Well, I read The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene recently, and I have a greater sort of view of confession and its necessity and just its overall meaning. Uh, so much more after reading that book. The desire and for the possibility of not having it as an option.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had friends during the lockdown. I mean, here in Austria, I was locked down with 8 priests, so I never lacked for the sacraments. But I had friends during the lockdown who were tearing their hair out because there was no confession to be had. And I remember a lot of my favorite parishes. If you went to their websites, They would say, make a perfect act of contrition, make a spiritual communion, donate here.
And I think that was in the book too.
Yeah, it was. It certainly affected me very deeply. I mean, I donated millions spiritually during lockdown. And as you can imagine, my horror that the IRS didn't accept those donations.
Didn't accept spiritual donations.
No,
Did
no.
you? So you filed them?
I feel, of course, spiritual money for spiritual sacraments. What?
No.
And to my utter, it shows you the anti-Catholicism of the IRS. They wouldn't accept it. They said, no, if it's not actual legal tender, we're not giving you a tax write-off.
That's terrible. They should be
It's
ashamed of
awful.
themselves.
I thought so. I'd have taken it to the Supreme Court if I could have found a diocese to back me. But nobody seemed interested in my case, so I had to drop it.
Well, I guess they probably didn't feel very good about your spiritual donations, anyways.
They probably spent them on spiritual trips to Vegas or something.
Spiritual.
But
what would that look like, Charles? Spiritual trips to Vegas.
like nothing. It's totally spiritual. I can't tell you.
They
Spiritual
thought,
trips to a spiritual Vegas. I couldn't tell you.
ooh, I want to know what spiritual Vegas is like.
What happens in spiritual Vegas stays in spiritual Vegas. I'm afraid I couldn't tell you even if I had been there.
Is it something where you forget right away?
Oh yeah. I mean, even before it happens, you forget it. It's I mean, the one thing you can say about it is that it's certainly discreet.
Yeah, you think people should do more spiritual adventures to spiritual places, so
Who
then
says they aren't? Who says they aren't? Who could tell? Who would
they're
know?
not tracked.
Yeah, I mean, you may have been to Atlantis last night. Who's to say?
Maybe.
See? I can neither confirm or deny.
Where would
But
you like to go spiritually?
oh gosh, where not to go spiritually? The White House.
Does that mean you're haunting it?
I'm sorry?
Would that mean you're haunting the White House?
Maybe. I could take the place of President Lincoln in the Lincoln bedroom, and scare the wits out of whoever was there.
I'm not
I've
sure
been there
you want to do that,
physically.
to be honest.
Oh well, yeah, that would be good. I've been to the White House physically though, so it's not quite the same excitement.
Oh, okay. But you could I don't know, who's one member of the administration who you might want to haunt?
Well, President Trump wouldn't be able to see me anyway, so
Okay.
that wouldn't be a problem. I don't know, maybe you know what? None of them deserve that kind of abuse.
Okay. Just checking. Oh, fine. Congress.
I'd have to try or quadrilocate.
Oh, there'd be too many.
Yeah, I mean, too many congressmen to haunt.
Well, they're all in the same place. You could just, walk through the walls to the different offices.
Well, that's true. That's true. All right. You know what? I probably want to haunt the two chaplains.
Not even Congress, just the chaplains.
Well, see, that way I could tell the chaplains that if they don't want me to keep showing up and scaring them, then they'll give Congress a rip roaring sermon every morning.
Do you think they'd be able to see you?
The chaplains, why shouldn't they? I'm spiritual. They're spiritual. They may not be religious, but they're spiritual.
They're spiritual, but not religious. Okay, sure.
Well, I mean, America's national chaplain should reflect America, and America is spiritual, if not religious.
What does that practically mean?
In God we trust.
So nothing.
I don't believe what I'm hearing. I didn't come on the show to have my country attacked.
Your country?
Yes, my country, 'tis of thee.
Says the guy in Vienna.
I don't know what to say to that.
Well, I'm in America. You're in Vienna. What like?
So I was born in New York. You weren't. It's not your fault. I'll tell you this much: the I had not this past election, but the election before 2020. For the umpteenth time, some celebrities said that if so and so were elected, they'd leave the country. Well, that always drives me crazy, and I exploded. I said, I hate it when people say that. And somebody very, very intelligently wrote back, "Yeah, you just left without threatening." And I had to admit that that was true. And then I said, "Yeah, but nobody would care if I made the threat."
Well, more celebrities have been actually following through this year.
Ah, what a loss to the world.
Uh, well, more like some went to Ireland. Poor Ireland.
Ireland deserves whatever they get. I mean, I no, I'm quite honest. If you
Oh
go
yeah,
if you travel around Ireland, quite apart from their voting in gay marriage and abortion, quite apart from that, if you go to Ireland today, and I speak from experience as one who's traveled there quite a bit in the last few years, and I do love the country. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. But three-quarters of the places you go that advertise traditional music in the evening, they have songs by those old traditional Irish Gaelic songsmiths, Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash.
they lost in the '60s.
Somebody did, probably Ireland being Ireland, probably the 80s. But whatever the
Oh,
case, this is what you hear. And I was at one place. Sometimes I'll lose it and say, you know what? Can you sing anything traditional? And they'll say, well, sure, if you'll sing it.
what?
If you'll sing it. So I said, well, all right. So I've done this in a number of places in Ireland. I've found myself singing, which doesn't bother me. But the last time this happened, I won't say where, but it was Galway. Uh, the band they had just played. It was a duo actually. They had just played, and one of the locals was dancing to it, Jailhouse Rock. So I kind of lost it, and I went up to them. I said, "Look, could you do Whiskey in the Jar?" And the lady who was the vocalist said, "Well, yeah, if you'll sing it." And I said, "Okay, sure." Well, I got to tell you, it was my worst rendition of Whiskey in the Jar ever because I had to sing according to their beat and their tempo, right?
Yeah.
So it was, as I went out a rambling o'er the western Kerry mountains. You get the idea. And I sang the whole thing that way.
So
And
sorry.
they thought it was great, but I'll tell you what, it was messed up my breathing like you wouldn't believe. But I croaked the words out. Oh, that was great. I was like, yeah, that was wonderful. Because
They
it's an
really,
up. Hmm?
they really are stuck in the '80s.
Yeah, pretty
That's
much.
that's concerning. Like, just I don't even know how many places would play Elvis Presley just randomly in America.
Well, that's because we've lost our traditional music in America. It's not like Ireland where they've kept our traditional music,
Wait, what?
huh?
Now
What?
I'm confused. I have no idea.
Yeah, me too. But let's move along. Nothing to see here now. We've all got homes to go to. Move along.
Okay. Yes, move along, move along. Now let's sort of just dive into the 5 points of traditional monarchy you set forward as the basically if you agree with this, you are a monarchist or a traditional Catholic monarchist. Um, so first one is altar. If you would like to give us a explanation.
Sure. Basically, the first point, the altar, refers to the place of the church in public life, to the place of uh, the Catholic faith as the vessel, the means of transmission of legitimacy, of authority from Almighty God to the state. And this is at once symbolically and really exemplified by the coronation and the anointing of the king. based, of course, on the anointing of King David in the Bible. Catholic kingship being a participation, you might say, in the kingship of Christ, our Lord himself being the rightful heir of David in his human nature, and his having fused that kingship with the communion of the church at the Last Supper. That's the meaning of the washing of the feet, actually. Well, because of this, society, the state, has to reflect the church. Ultimately, its goal is the same as the church's, the salvation of every subject, but its means are different. The church, of course, has the power and the way, the truth, and the life of applying the merits of Christ to every individual via the sacraments. That's how that actually works. The state, the king, the monarchy, on the one hand, has the obligation to assist her, physically and otherwise, in that quest, partly by support, partly by ensuring that the laws reflect the laws of God, and partly by attempting to create a situation wherein the individual can look at his faith and his soul and pursue it, and not worry about being either stolen, or having his stuff stolen, himself abused, or being starved. So those are the two ways whereby the monarch, the state, is supposed to assist the church in its duty. But in return, the church legitimizes the authority of the monarch, and authority is a very different thing from power. Authority is the right to say what should happen. Power is the ability to make it so. And in traditional Catholic monarchies, well, we'll deal with that on the second point. But suffice to say that from God via the church comes legitimacy, comes authority for the king or the emperor.
Does this have any, or is there any substantial difference between this and sort of integralism?
Yes, in the sense that a lot of integralists, well, it has a certain difference from some integralists.
Okay.
Who will argue that the form of the state really doesn't matter so long as the church does this. Now, so in other words, for a lot of integralists, you could have a Catholic republic. The problem for the Catholic monarchists is that none of those have ever lasted very long, and they've been inherently unstable because the means of transmission of authority is inherently unstable. And the problems you'll get, the erection of personality-driven factions into ideological parties, is an inherent problem with the Republican system. Mind you, it happens under monarchies too. The more the less they resemble monarchy, and the more Republican they become.
Hmm.
I mean, today you'd have to call most European monarchies crown republics. That doesn't mean they don't have a certain virtue, a certain uh, superiority to most republics, but the amount of that superiority is very small in comparison.
And diminishing as we speak.
And yeah, that's fair to say, diminishing as we speak.
Yeah. So next up is the throne.
Well, the throne is the nature of that monarchy. I've said that the king has authority. Well, he does. Traditionally, while the king had authority, the right to say what ought to be done, his power was limited by a number of things. One, of course, the moral teachings expounded by the church and the very traditions of his office. At every Catholic coronation, a king made an oath to his people in the sight of Almighty God to maintain their rights and laws and privileges. Well, when you said that, you've already said there are places beyond which he can't go. Now, the nature of pre and early modern society was such that power, the ability to make things happen, was very diffuse amongst the population. The king did have some, the church had some, the guilds had some, the peasants had some, the nobility had some, the cities had some, and on and on and on and on. But that being the case, when you had a good king, he was like an orchestra leader. Using his authority, he was able to coordinate the different elements in the realm to more or less go along the same page. When you had a bad king, although he might make life unpleasant for the people around him, uh, you didn't get a despotism, you got anarchy. And that was the Achilles heel of the way that system was applied in the Middle Ages. That's why you had civil wars like the Wars of the Roses, things like that, was because that was the thing it was given to. And that ultimately is what gave rise to the modern state. Now, today, what we have is the reverse of the situation, where authority was concentrated in the king and the monarchy, in the king and the church, rather. And power was diffuse. Today, power is concentrated, as shown by the ability of our masters to put us to bed without supper during COVID. But authority is diffuse among the electorate, and so it's not very effective. Um, the other thing about this sort of a setup is that what a modern version of monarchy would look like, this kind of monarchy, would be a monarch with sufficient power to restrain the different elements of the state from oppressing the majority. That's what that looks like now. And you saw a foreshadowing of it really with the English Civil War, the so-called Wars of the Three Kingdoms in England, Scotland, and Ireland, when, amongst other things, Charles I was fighting the enclosures, which were acts that, without going into detail, basically would drive the peasants off the estates in the countryside. And they would have to come to the city and become the ancestors of the urban mob. Well, that was one of the things the king was fighting, because as king, he was sworn to defend the rights of his subjects, and that included the poor peasants. And that is why the people who opposed him were the wealthy oligarchs, who, a lot of whom had become Puritans religiously. And the irony there, of course, is that that oligarchy was their grandparents, or their grandfathers, literally, were the ones Henry VIII had given the monastic lands to.
Yeah. One of the sort of maybe a contemporary comparison is, or example of what you're talking about, is that I believe I've heard recently said that 10% of the population hold 90% of the stock market, like own 90% of the stock market.
Yeah, that's fair to say, and that's fine, but they need someone to keep them in line alongside everyone else. In other words, the 10% should no more be able to lord it over the 90% than the 90% should be able to steal their stuff. You understand? You need a
Yes.
balance, and that obviously the political machinery is in a non-monarchical setup. The political machinery will always be in the hands of that 10%. And if you had a revolution like the communists, you would soon just get another 10%, a different 10%.
Yeah, whoever they raised up, basically, or
Yeah,
party members.
yeah. In the immortal words of the Who, same old boss, same as the new boss. And it was Franz Josef who made the great statement when he was asked by former President Teddy Roosevelt what his view of a modern monarch was, and his response was, protecting my people from their politicians. And I really can't think of a better way to put it than that.
Yeah. Why was Teddy Roosevelt like visiting Franz Josef?
Well, he had retired from the presidency and he wanted to see a bit more of the world that he had seen up to that time. So he left. He went on a around the world tour. After the presidency, he toured around a lot. He went hunting in Africa with his son Kermit. Wrote a book about it on African game trails, and he traveled to a lot of places he'd always wanted to see and never had the leisure to see. Partly because he was a young and up and coming politician, and then because he was president. But because he had been president, he had entree to everywhere and everybody.
Yeah. He was definitely larger than life. It's very impressive.
Oh yeah, he sure was. And insofar as a wasp could be, a benevolent figure.
On to subsidiarity.
All right. Well, the third point we would call subsidiarity, and in days gone by, people like the Carlists and the Jacobites and the rest of them would have called local liberties or provincial rights or whatever. And that is the notion that under the king, um, self government was a guarantee. And one of the things you find in early modern medieval Europe is that not just the provinces, but the cities as they were, the universities, a lot of local institutions had rights that were part of the laws of the country, the custom of the country, that the king had sworn to maintain. So it was an interesting thing whereby, well, you take the idea of the king's peace. Now, because our system of common law in the United States is a monarchical one, we inherited it lock, stock, and barrel from England. There are actually a lot of monarchical concepts that don't make sense under our system, but nevertheless we've inherited. And one of them is the idea of the king's peace. Now, where do you have that? Well, you've heard the phrase disturbing the peace. We call minor judicial figures justices of the peace. You're bound over to keep the peace. Well, that peace is the king's peace. And on every local level, and this shows you the difference as well in our philosophical backgrounds. Because for us, peace is just an absence of conflict. But for our fathers, it was a lot more. It was the way things ought to be. You maintained the peace, the king's peace, in his name. So a concrete example of how this would work. You and I are peasants living out in some dump somewhere, but the king's highway goes by not too far. Now, mind you, the king doesn't maintain it. The locals maintain it. The local lords or the city maintain the road in the name of the king, but it's the king's highway because the king's messengers go along the king's highway. But someone is playing robber on the king's highway. So the local squire or the sheriff or whatever local person of authority we've got sounds the hue and cry, and we all get together, and he leads us out to go after him, this robber on the king's highway. And we catch him. So he gets a fair trial in front of one of the king's judges, and then we hang him high, and the king's peace is restored, and everyone goes back to doing whatever they were doing. Now, what did the king actually have to do with that?
A symbol.
It's a symbol, but a powerful one. In those days, and I'm not saying that a modern version of this would look very different, obviously. But in those days, because the king did not really have a secret police or an internal revenue or all the other benefits of modern governance that we have, that we enjoy, if a city or a lord or something or other was disruptive, all he could really do was declare that person, place, or thing an outlaw. But what did that mean? Well, it meant that any of the person, place, and thing's neighbors that had the means to could take his stuff. So he didn't want to be declared an outlaw.
Nope.
because otherwise you'd be literally outside the law, and every man's hand was against you, unless they thought justice was on your side, in which case they'd squint and grin and not look.
Robin
And
Hood.
Robin Hood. And you see, even the story of Robin Hood is an interesting illustration because the way we tell it, all you think of is Robin Hood stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Well, no. It's a little more complex than that because he was doing all that in the name of the rightful king, whose man he was. He was not simply taking from the rich or the oppressors and giving to the oppressed. He was doing so in the name of the king, the rightful king, who was absent. And in all the versions of the stories we have, it basically comes to an end when the king returns.
Yeah. Richard the Lionheart.
Richard Lionheart. And you know, I'm not a fan of Kevin Costner, the actor, by any stretch of the imagination. And the film he did, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, was a terrible film. I couldn't stand it. Robin Hood, Prince of Dweebs, I called it. But I reviewed it for the National Catholic Register.
I prefer the satire one.
Oh yeah, Men in Tights.
Yeah, Men in
But
Tights.
the what should happen? But that at the very end of the film, Sean Connery rides on stage with four knights as King Richard the Lionheart. Costner doesn't leave the stage, but he vanishes. All you see is King Richard.
Isn't that bad casting though? Sean Connery as Richard the Lionheart.
Well, we did a good job at it. I mean, Sean Connery was a very. If you needed someone to play someone terribly impressive, he was great.
I guess I'm just thinking of the Scottish part.
Oh no, he could do. I mean, he played Robin Hood, you know, in Robin and Marian. He played an elderly Robin Hood.
Oh, okay. So so
Uh,
was he doing a like noble English accent in that movie?
oh yeah,
Oh,
he
okay.
was and he was. I mean, he had the gravitas and all this kind of thing.
Okay.
And even though you know Costner didn't never left the screen, you just didn't see him. He was gone. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So at any rate, that's that. So subsidiarity, then local rights, etc. The most governing done at the lowest level possible.
Now on to solidarity.
Well, solidarity, uh, again, in those days, the different elements of society that we spoke of as having certain kinds of power, and we're talking about, you know, artisans, farmers, lords, the church, every group that goes to make up society, we're seen as being part of a single family. We are used to Marxism, to the idea of the inherent necessity of class conflict. What was the case there was the notion of the king acting as common father to all the different estates of the realm, to the different classes, all of which was seen as necessary for the common weal, the common good. Everybody had a role to play, everybody was important in their sphere. There's a medieval illustration of this that I've seen in many different versions, but you basically see a priest, a knight, standing in for the nobility, and a peasant. And under each is a description. So under the priest, you see, I bless all. Under the knight, I defend all. Under the peasant, I feed all. Now, you look at those three, and they're obviously essential. If A, you believe in God and the faith. B, if you know something about the real world, you know people need protecting, and most of us don't know how to do it. So it falls upon those who do know how to protect the realm to do so. And it falls to the king to decide how that should be done. But they're seen as equally important, equally essential elements of society. Now, where this really began to rip was the Protestant revolt, of course, when in many places kings and then the nobility turned against the church and created one of their own. But then that church, be it Lutheran, be it Anglican or whatever, took in domestic life the role of the church, although not the role of conscience of the king that the church had, because of course, no longer independent, was no longer in a position to tell the king this or that was not moral. But that setup really began to collapse and to tear apart with the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the modern class system. Now, after the French Indian Wars, after the French Revolution, 1815, the conservatives, the right in Europe, were faced with two separate things that got more and more intense. With all of they got more intense with every decade because of the rise of industry and the creation of a class that was outside all of this tradition, and that was the proletariat. And they were often miserable. So, what faced conservatives, what faced Catholics, were on the one hand, how do you preserve, retain, update the old order, the monarchy, and the rest of it? And how do you look after this new class and restrain their mirror image, the other new class, the haute bourgeoisie, the owners, the factory owners, the bankers, all those people? How do you, on the one hand, fit them in to the old system and integrate them into a cohesive society? Well, one answer, of course, was Marxism. Get rid of everything else, and, and you're good to hook. Which was an answer, of course, but not one that appealed to a lot of people. You had the classical liberal response, which was don't worry about them, just make sure they keep working. And then you had the Catholic response, the conservative response in non-Catholic countries, which was try to rebuild the old system in a modern way that fits. And out of that attempt came a lot of the church's social teaching, things like distributism, corporatism, solidarism. They had a lot of words for it, but they're all basically guild socialism. They're all basically attempting to reintegrate both labor and capital into a semi-harmonious society. And that we call solidarity, the idea of class cooperation rather than class conflict. Now, in the sort of system I'm talking about, it's a bit easier because with the church and the king, you have a focus of unity that can serve beyond selfish class instincts.
Yeah. So on the final one is well, it goes by many names. I prefer to call it Christendom because I think that's I don't know, easier to understand than some of the others.
Yeah.
But you can explain the than other names as well.
Well, basically, it was the idea that since there were a number of states of this kind that had that sort of those 4 points as their constitution, in some sense, they were all part of a larger family. That they weren't merely separate, and this is where nationalism was, which already was sort of subsumed into the greater whole, depending on the nature of the particular country. The idea that all Christian nations formed a family of countries that ought not to fight each other, ought not to kill each other. And there were different words for it. One was Christendom, which, as you say, is the easiest to grasp. There was what was called the Respublica Christiana, the Christian Republic. Now, republic does not mean republic in our sense. It just means public things, race things, public republic, meaning the totality of Christian states as a loose union. As you've already seen, each of these countries was a fairly loose union itself. So the idea was that this higher union was uh, equally subsidiary, if you get what I mean.
Mhm.
Now, then the other idea, which is the hardest for us to understand, they had in German they used the word Abendland, which means evening land, and that meant the Christian West versus Morgenland, the pagan East, because of course the sun rises in the east, sets in the west, so evening land, morning land. And in French, you spoke of l'Occident and l'Orient, the west and the east. And then the last and hardest for us to understand is the idea of the Holy Empire, the notion that all of these countries are part of that Christian empire baptized by Theodosius the Great in 380, and the various barbarian kingdoms that grew up within its boundaries. And the idea that in some sense the king, or the emperor rather, played the role toward the various kings that the Pope did toward the bishops, and that the kings did toward the various vassals in the state. But this was the Reichsidee, uh, as it was called, the imperial idea. It's very difficult to translate into other languages because everyone has a different view of it. If you say imperial idea in English, people immediately think of the British Empire. If you say the imperial idea in French, people think of Napoleon. So the notion of the Holy Empire as it was, which in a way sort of encompasses the ideas behind the late Christian Empire of Theodosius on the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and oddly enough, in certain aspects, the self-image of both pre-World War One Austria-Hungary and Russia. Wherever you see the double eagle, that uh, that points to that notion. Obviously, the notion itself was damaged severely by the fall of Constantinople, by the Protestant revolt, although it limped on. Uh, and there's a yearning for it, a subconscious yearning for it behind the founding of both the European Union and the UN. And in the case of the EU, the founders of the EU, three of whom, Schumann, de Gasperi, and Adenauer, were looked at for sainthood at different times. And de Gasperi and Schumann, it's being pursued. They looked at what they were trying to build with the EU as a revival of Charlemagne's empire. Now, that idea pretty much faded in the 60s, but it was there. And I think it's still a better idea than anything else we've come up with since.
Yes, definitely. Well said. I mean, so those are the things that you can look at to see if you're a monarchist. Also, buy the book, The Complete Monarchist. Charles, where's the best place to find the book?
Well, you could find it at Los Justi Press, who are publishing it. The fine people at Tumblr House will be happy to supply it. And if you have no other choice, you can enrich Lord Bezos's coffers and get it through Amazon.
Well said. Also, one last thing. You talk about the Inklings and and you talk about their works and their views on society and politics. Mostly Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and then Charles Williams. I'm not very familiar with Williams's work, where would you suggest starting if I haven't since I haven't read anything of his? And I
Well,
imagine he's the least known.
if you haven't read it, you shouldn't. No. Uh,
Wow. I see how
no,
it is
no.
now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's only for those of us who know. No, I would start with All Hallows Eve,
Okay.
which is he wrote a number of these. I guess you would call them occult thrillers, supernatural thrillers, which is exactly what they are. But they're quite well done. Uh, I mean, I'm fond of all of his novels, but I would say that uh, the second one, War in Heaven, is also a really good piece. It deals with the return of the Holy Grail,
Okay. Awesome.
but
Well,
I would start with All Hallows Eve.
mhm. Awesome. Wonderful. I look forward to it. I will definitely pick that up at some point. I think I forget him sometimes, amongst the different writers. But as I move through them, which one of the things you said, if you said it's only for the people who know or have read or whatever. Uh that wouldn't do well for your book, because a lot of stuff you say, like, and point out, which I love about your books, is that nobody's going to know like half of the people that you reference and that
Well,
you
no,
bring into the discussion, which provides us an opportunity to jump into basically the forgotten people of history.
well, that's very true. I mean, you see, history, as they say, is written by the victors on the one hand, and it's a little bit like the Inquisition. When people ask what I think about it, I say, well, you've got to understand it was a terrible failure because it was created to prevent the creation of the kind of world we live in.
Mhm.
You understand, we live in the kind of world the Inquisition was designed to stop from happening.
Yes, certainly.
So that's an important thing to bear in mind. You know, one of the things I have to point out, people always will say, oh, well, you think everything would be perfect if we had a monarchy? No, no, see, that's the point. It will never be perfect. Never. There will always be struggle and strife and sin and pain as long as we crawl in this mortal coil. But it can be better. It doesn't have to be a constant serving of garbage every bloody day. And it doesn't have to be choosing between separate piles of garbage. You get to choose. Do you want decaying beef or do you want maggot filled pork? You get to choose.
I think, Charles, you should do every political advertisement for in every election. You should be like, it should be banned from everybody else doing them, but you have to do them for each each
Oh, that would be
candidate.
fine. Yeah, vote vote for Sherman Wabery. He'll steal from you, but only to a point. You know,
What? Who's
you
the
know.
uh, who's the alternative?
Well, the alternative, uh, Marcus Torrington. He doesn't have a brain in his head, but he means well.
See, wouldn't this be great if you did all the advertisements?
Yeah, it would be. Cast your votes, ladies and gentlemen, and remember: vote early and vote often.
What about when you're dead?
What do you mean?
Aren't you supposed to vote then too?
Well, particularly then, you should leave in your will a long list of candidates.
All that start with D.
Yeah, oddly enough,
Yeah.
the no, actually, I knew a fellow, the late lamented Jim Thomas. I don't mind mentioning his name now that he's dead. What this guy knew about voter fraud, nobody knew. He was an expert. He'd been a Democratic Party Paul in New York for a long time, and he knew the ins and outs of voter fraud. Uh, but he used to say, you got to remember, voter fraud only works in swing seats where the two are close enough.
Mm-hmm.
then it can make a difference. You can't do voter fraud in a safe seat because you've always got 3/4 of the electorate going for one party or the other. The
Yeah.
amount of voter fraud to work would be, you couldn't do it. So if you're very keen on voter fraud, do everything you can to make sure that the two parties are as equal as possible in your district. And that'll make it a lot easier. Also, another good thing is if your electoral laws are very complex. The more
Confusing is
complex,
always good.
yeah, well, they are. He gave you as an example the voting laws in Wisconsin versus the voting laws in New York.
Mm-hmm.
New York, Wisconsin. And the trick is the simpler the voting laws are, the easier to understand, the harder it becomes to commit voter fraud.
Yeah. Well, Charles, and everybody else, I wholly endorse this book, The Complete Monarchist. I hope everyone goes out and buys it. And also, Charles, you have a Substack now, the Coulombe Company. I will link that in the description as well.
Coulombe's company.
Or
I do indeed
Coulombe.
have a Substack, Coulombe's company, to which I owe a paper this week, so I've got to get cracking. But I had an interview I had to do this afternoon, so I didn't do what I was going to do. No, it's
I
fine.
see how it is.
Don't
I
feel
think you're
guilty.
just copying me. I make a Substack, then you make a Substack. I think you're just copying.
Everybody's doing Substacks now, which
I know. Nobody's
it's.
copying anyone.
I think what it really is simply that you everything has become so polarized that if you want to say what you want to say, you've got to, well, say it. um. Anyway, no. So yeah, thus we have the Substack, and of course there's Off the Menu, my monthly podcast, weekly podcast. Thank you.
I wish it was
Uh,
daily, if only.
oh gosh, I know that I'd laugh too hard. I'd be in an early grave. So would Vinny. But
Yeah,
no,
probably.
we do joke a lot. And then you can get my stuff in Catholicism.org, uh, Crisis, 1 Peter 5, and in the European Conservatives magazine.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, and they've got a lot of my former. There's been sort of a change of management on the website,
okay.
so you won't on the European Conservative. What do you call
Website.
it? Yeah, well, not the website, but the page.
Hey,
Yeah, the online whatever it is. Anyway, the point is, there's been a change in management there, so
so
new
you're
stuff
the
won't be.
magazine.
I'm just to the magazine henceforth, but the
Yeah.
magazine has my past work, and you can go to look up my past stuff in the American Thinker and Tacky's magazine and places like that.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on, Charles, and God bless everyone. Bye.
God bless you, dear fellow. Take care, and remember, we've got not just Easter, but the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord coming up.
Yay.
And I'll leave you with this thought, which is actually to me kind of a disturbing one.
Okay.
50 years ago, everybody and his brother were all over the centennial. The 250th anniversary of the country is coming up, and very few people are saying anything about it.
I know there's something happening in Iowa, but that's about
Yeah,
it.
well, I mean, there are places. So I would urge you to get in touch. Every state's supposed to have a semi-quincentennial. I think that's what it's called, semi-quincentennial. Um, Semi-quincentennial commission. California voted down creating one.
Okay.
Uh,
Sounds very Californian.
well, they had too much money to spend on other things, like
I don't
Governor
want to
Newsom.
offend anyone.
Well, and Governor Newsom, needs as much dough in his face as possible.
That's why he started a podcast. Well, yeah.
California, California, California.
He's fixed up so well he has time for a podcast.
Well, the only thing I can say is we reelected the moron, and if you reelect a moron, you've won yourself. You know,
Oh,
voting for a moron it's like a tar baby. You know the story of the tar baby,
no.
the Grimace.
Well,
Well,
Charles, we should probably just you can tell me that I'm gonna let's say goodbye though
yeah,
first.
well, we have to say goodbye. But the next time you see Connor, if it's a live thing, you ask him questions, ask him about the tar baby, because he's gonna know.
I'll have forgotten, but that's all right. But mock me for it if you had the chance. Okay. Bye everyone.